like to introduce you to the moderator. And he is team member Park Dong-chan from Horizon at the Youth Secretariat team.
Us today for K-diaspora Mnemonic, searching ultimate measures through it. Riots for Coexistence. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now I would like to hand over the stage to Park Dong-chan. Everyone, please welcome the moderator.
네, 반갑습니다.
I'm very pleased to meet you all. My name is Dong-chan Park, team member. And once again, I am heading the Horizon group. I'll be working as a moderator. Also, I am doing my best in studying at the Graduate School of Seoul National University. 1992, about 3 decades ago. Do you still remember LA riots? How much do you know that? It's been 3 decades ever since LA riots has occurred. We were very much disinterested in the riots. However, the victims were Korean Americans, the diaspora, and the reality is that we don't know much about them. Here and there, we talk a lot about the Korean immigrants. More than 7.5 million live across the world. Today, we'll be talking about K-diaspora, the definitions, the history, and also from the perspective of K-diaspora, we'd like to interpret the significance of LA riots. And also, how can we realize the true sense of Korean reality, coexistence, co-prosperity? How can we improve the public awareness and explore the directions of coexistence? Let me introduce the panelists. First of all, on my left, we have with us columnist Hyung-eun Kang, who is also the photographer and as well as a reporter. Columnist Kang Hyung-eun has worked in numerous press and has received more than 2 times the Pulitzer Award. Especially, he has covered the LA riots right on site. He took the photos and also he wrote numerous articles. So he's a living witness of that incident. On his left, we have with us Professor Yoon In-jin of the Korea University Department of Sociology. He's also the president of the Korean International Migration Studies Association. For a long time, Korean immigration and also international immigrations, the issue of K-diaspora was his main interest. And I'm sure that thanks to his contributions, we are going to have a very enriched discussion. Right next to him, we have with us Director Chun Hoo-seok or Joseph Chun from the Diaspora Film. The director, Chun, makes a lot of documentaries and also he is very much focused in the K-diaspora. And also the 5 Korean immigrants trying to work in the political circle. He made films and it will soon be released. And including himself, his colleagues, his friends, the difficulties or identity issues, or also the feelings of disappointment and also all kinds of hardship that they have suffered. He will be talking about that. On his left, we also have Director Choi Sang-gu. Ever since he joined Korea International Network, he's currently serving as a director. He sends the calendar and also he's involved in various activities, especially related with Korean immigrants living in Japan. So we have 4 panelists with us today. And they all represent their own circle and also their own generation. From the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, they are representing their own generation. And also, I am in my 20s, just for your reference. So let's kick off officially our session. We have 4 main themes. First theme, let's start our discussion. So before I ask a question, I'd like to ask for your understanding. Well, We have put the theme of today's session as LA riots, but can we really regard it as a riot? Is it uprising? So we still have not reached an agreement whether we should define it as riots or uprising, because riots are more publicized. So tentatively, we are going to use the word riot instead of uprising. So I ask for your understanding. The first question or first agenda is, well, Kang Hyung-won, the columnist who has covered LA riots, will talk about that. Hello.
당시
So you were there covering the news about LA riot. So I think you are the best person to report to us about what has happened during the riot. Well, it's more than just a riot because it has taken a long time leading up to that event. And those of you who know about LA riot would often refer to 투준자 shooting as the triggering point. So can you give us some idea
네, 우리
about what it was like in LA during that time? Well, Korean migrated to the US in 1903, and in the 1990s, LA had the largest number of Korean community.
세대들이 가지고
And first generation Korean immigrants there had certain cultural barriers that they were not able to overcome. It was because they were not accustomed to American culture, customs, and language. So they would own shops and they would have some problems in dealing with their customers. Of course, there were shop owners who had strong bond with the neighbors, but there were shop owners who had suffered from cultural difference and communication problems. Of course, I have worked in Los Angeles Times, the largest newspaper company in the western part of LA, western part of the US, but I was the only Korean-speaking journalist out of thousands of journalists for LA Times. Therefore, many Korean people were suffering from communication and cultural barriers, and when we had that 투순자 incident, for 1 year before that incident, many shop owners owned by Korea, well, about a dozen Korean people have either died or injured by shooting. But the shop owners falling victim to shooting were not covered by the newspapers. But whenever there was an incident of, like Latasha, the black girl who died from shooting by 투순자, it was covered so frequently by the newspaper, and the headline was, 투순자 killed a person by shooting just because of a bottle of orange juice. It was a very provocative and incendious headline. And there were some mentioning of strategic failure by the police and how the Korean community has not been able to voice its concerns and needs to the mainstream of the U.S. society. And all these were identified as the cause of LA riot. And is there any irony in covering the news? Of course, this kind of incident actually originated from the black and white conflict, but the Korean diasporas were, became the main culprit or the victim of this kind of social conflict in the 1960s. There were a lot of policies designed to promote the human rights of black people, but even in the 1990s, black people were still suffering from social economic prejudice or inequities. Many black people had problems climbing the social ladder, and there were black people living in slum areas. And what's riot in LA? Many shops were burned, and these shops have not been restored even to this date. And many Korean shop owners had to open their stores in these kind of high-risk areas. And throughout the history of Korean immigration, when you look at how the US media covers those stories related to immigrants, they have often been lacking. And the immigrants' voices were not properly reflected in the mainstream media, probably because there were very limited number of journalists who spoke the Korean language or other language. So the US police were kind of a bystander when it comes to shootings by Korean people. And Korean young people established a vigilant group, Self-Guard. And I think one of your pictures that you have used to discover this, to identify and report this incident, showed a picture of Korean vigilante. And because the police were not protecting the Korean shop owners had no option but to protect themselves and arm themselves with guns. In the US history, well, all the Japanese were taken to the prison camp after the Second World War, and the Chinese people from Chang Dynasty, they were not allowed to bring their families to the US for 100 years. But the Korean people did not succumb to such persecution, and we mobilized our own vigilante forces and self-guard force, protecting their own shops. This has actually, the Korean Americans have changed the image of Asians in the US society. So what you're seeing on the screen are pictures that you have taken yourselves. Can you share some more pictures with us? This picture is from a Korean market, Korean people trying to protect themselves. You know, trying to protect themselves against the oncoming rioters, and thanks to their defense, the shop was safe, was properly protected. And there was a fire in one of the Korean shops, but the firefighters could not come to extinguish the fire because the firefighters would come under fire if they approached this fire. And most of the residents in the area were Hispanics. And the Hispanic residents saw the live coverage of this fire, and since there was no police, these Hispanic residents came to the Korean shops and stole a lot of goods from the Korean shops, and many of the people who were arrested as thieves were Hispanic people and Korean young people who were, protecting the Korean shops. Mr. Lee Jae-sung, one of the young Korean men, was killed, and because of that, the police were brought into the Korean town. And the first thing the police did was to disarm Korean self-guards, and there was a funeral for Mr. Lee Jae-sung. And this has brought about reconciliation between different race groups, and Mr. Lee Jae-sung was the only son in the family for 3 generations. This young boy was working in his father's shop and was shot to death. And these young Korean men, many of them were injured during the riot. So they gave up on their American dreams, and they're still living a very difficult life, even to this day.
한번 보여주셨는데 제가 또 어제 기자님과 잠깐 사적인
So we talked about one of the girls' pictures yesterday, and her family had a oil station. Yes, oil station was burned during the riot, and they could not build the business back. and she's suffering from the trauma, and her father died from this incident. Was there any legal compensation, fair legal compensation? The immigrant community could not benefit from legal compensation because they were not supported through institutional or legislative support like insurance. Or now the Korean Americans are doing much more to overcome cultural barriers and protect themselves better. And on top of the material damage, what about the mental trauma that they are suffering even to this day? 30 years on, there are many unresolved wounds or trauma, right? Many of the buildings that were burnt during the riots still have not been recovered. And first-generation Korean immigrants, many of them used to own and run liquor stores or convenience stores. And when they bought the business, they had to pay a lot of money for the business title. But business title, which also included license to sell alcohol. But politicians did not allow them to extend their license. So they just had to lose a lot of money to pay for the money they had paid for their license. Yes, thank you very much. You're giving us a very lively coverage of what happened during the LA riot.
홍은 기자님께서 LA 폭동의 역사
So columnist Kang Hyung-won gave us a lively picture of what happened during the LA riot to Korean immigrants there. And now we would like to invite Professor Yoo In-jin and Professor Yoon. What made Korean people go overseas and settle down there? So great to meet you, Professor Yoon.
여러분
Well, we have been repeatedly saying that LA riots not only expresses the racial discriminations, but also the political confrontations or social conflict. It encompasses all kinds of conflict. As a social scholars, how can you define LA riots? What is your perspective? What is your take on this? Well, when we look at LA riots itself, of course, there was a discrimination against the black, and once again, the black wanted so kind of punishment because they felt that they were discriminated, and the fair and more justifiable treatment must be given to them. So against the white people, they wanted to express their anger and rage. And Rodney King, the driver, was driving really fast over the limit, and the white policeman stopped him and then actually carried out physical violence so much that it goes against the common sense. But after the court decision, the white policemen were found not guilty at all. But if you go to the South Central area, right above that area is a Koreatown, and the riot took place right next to Koreatown. Of course, passing through Koreatown, there is a Beverly Hills, which is known as the upper class village. So on their way toward Beverly Hills to carry a demonstration, they were blocked by the police. So what happened is the Koreatown was actually the place where these LA riots took place. And of course, this is a simple thing, you might think, but you have to understand why the black people's anger were poured against Korean people. Why? Because Korean people is recognized as sort of a sandwich between these two classes. On one side, a white upper class, on the lower part is a black lower class, and Korean is located in between these two classes. So in a very rigid class system, Korea is placed in between these two, quite near the black and white. And also, the Korean people, the Korean immigrants, they go to the US, and what they do is they work really hard and make sure that their children get well educations, and they go above middle class. Of course, they used to be middle class people, but they jump into the lower class, and then they work with their self-employed system itself, and they aspire to improve their social status. However, unlike the black people, the Korean people, they gather together in Koreatown, or they penetrate into the lower class people where a lot of blacks live together. And Korean people, against all the risk, they go to the area where black people are conglomerated, and then they aspire to improve their social status. But no matter how risky, how dangerous it is, they believe that if they work hard, they secure enough financial resources, they can move somewhere else. But from the black point of view, they believe the Koreans' existence itself are threatening themselves. They don't live there, but they just work there. They have their own shops, or sometimes they look down on black people. So they feel really bad against Korean people. And we briefly talk about another case that happened in the States. And Danny Bakewell is a nationalist who carried out very active, he's known as a crusade activist leader, and he carried out a boycott against Korean products. This was once again expressing their anger, frustrations against Korean people. So the nationalists of the black people were once again organizing their own team to stage demonstrations and once again expressing their anger, frustrations against Korean people, as if the black people were demonstrating against white people, as if the white people were physically, brutally carrying out violence against black people. And they thought the Korean people were also discriminating the black people. So they wanted to show that they were against Korean people as well. So the confrontation between the Korean people and the black, there are many reasons that have been accumulated for a long time. So it's all intertwined and interconnected. And the black, Asians, and also the class system is the one reason, because Koreans are sandwiched there. And second, Korean people, they want to improve their social status. That's why they open their own shops in the black residential area. Therefore, infiltrating the black people's village itself. And third, it has a great implication. Instead of helping each other, they believe that they are very harmful to each other from Korean people's perspective. They believe that they are far ahead of the black people economically, financially. They believe that they are on same par with the white people. They try to be one of the white class. While from the black's perspective, they believe that they are the native, the residents, the owner of that land. And then suddenly the strangers infiltrate into their own residential area and doing work, taking away their jobs and also opening their shops. So once again, they are dominating our society. That's how the black people live. They are actually the same minority class, but instead of having these peer-to-peer perceptions, they discriminate each other, they exclude each other, and such mutual concept was one of the main reasons, I believe.
하신 것처럼
Thank you, Professor. Between black and the Korean community or other social minorities, they tend to see racial struggle as a zero-sum game in the US. When Korean people first immigrated to the US, the Korean people had to move into the black communities. And the situation is similar to other groups of minorities around the world. You know, Korean people, when they moved to Japan, many of them had to work in casinos or pachinko, and you might have read about this in the novel Pachinko. Next, out of 7.5 million diasporas, we have the largest number of diasporas in the United States. I actually thought it would be the Chinese Korean community, but now we have a larger number of Korean diasporas living in the United States. So my question is, why are there so many Korean immigrants moving to the United States? Was there any social circumstances or specific region that has driven so many immigrants to move to the US? Well, you could look at the Korean immigration in 3 different stages. In 1902, in December, people left Incheon and went to Honolulu. So they actually arrived in Honolulu in January 1903, during the Japanese colonial period, before Korea was liberalized. That was the first stage of Korean immigration to the United States, and many of them were laborers who worked in sugarcane farms, and there's the photo bride who married these farmers who were working in Honolulu, and there are other group of Korean independence fighters who moved to Honolulu during that time. And the second stage is we experienced liberation and the Korean War, and there has been some changes to the U.S. immigration law. So there has been some transitional period before Korean people were lawfully able to move to the U.S. And the Korean orphans and Korean women who married American soldiers and small number of Korean students studying in the United States. So these were Korean immigrants during this transitional stage. But the U.S. revised its immigration law in 1965. Before that, the U.S. did not accept immigration from Asia, Latin America, or Africa, but there has been some criticism in the American society about such discriminatory nature of immigration law. So there has been some changes, and this has opened the door for Korean immigration. In the initial phase, the nurses moved to the US first, and then nurses later invited their families. So 1970s or early 1980s was the peak for Korean immigration. In 1 year, as many as 33,000 Koreans moved to the US in just 1 year. In 1988, there was the Korean Olympics, and since then, the US immigration has declined drastically. So recently, people are moving to the United States mainly for short term to study or to work, and later they change their status to permanent residents. And in the case of China, 1/3 of Chinese diasporas are now living in Korea. And the number of Korean diasporas in China has gone down, whereas the Korean diasporas in the US has continuously increased in number. The biggest difference here was that the US became more open to immigrations, has been lenient and open-minded to accepting foreign immigrants. When you compare many countries around the world, Japan is still very exclusive to foreigners, and Latin America, because of the economic difficulties, people don't move there in large numbers. So the US is still very open, and it is still seen as a land of opportunity to Korean wannabe immigrants. And 1903, January, that's when the US immigration, Korean immigration to the US started. So next year would be a very important year. But the situation or status of Korean immigrants in the United States still hasn't made much progress. So is there any realistic or the difficulties that Koreans are facing in the US? When it comes to material aspect or job status or residential benefits, I think the US diasporas are probably most blessed group of Koreans living abroad. However, the Korean people living in the US are forever aliens because we have different color of in skin, and because of the COVID-19, there is very strong anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. Even those Asian people who are born and grown in the US are still suffering from anti-Asian sentiment. So, of course, it is true that American society is more open, more accommodative to immigrants, but there still is a racial hierarchy there. WASP is at the top. Korean probably can go to the mid-level, but there is invisible glass ceiling for many Asians. And we are still not accepted as a full-fledged member of American society. Of course, there is institutional and financial integration, which has reached a high level, but when it comes to identity or sense of belonging or other integration-based values, it is still imperfect. Thank you very much, Professor. So, thank you for giving us a rundown on the history and the circumstances that Korean people are facing in the United States. Let's move on to the next discussion. And now, Director Chun Woo-seok, who is producing films about the history of Korean diasporas in the U.S.
감독님 오랜만입니다.
I haven't seen you for a long time, as far as what I know. You are coming and going in between the Korea and the United States. You are Korean immigrants living in the US. So you are actually K-diaspora. Why did you come back to Korea? And I mean, you were born in the States, right? Or how did you spend your early days, early life in the States? We would like to know your personal life. Well, my personal life is not that interesting, but the photos that the columnist Kang Hyung-un took, I actually experienced that. And it is my great honor to see Mr. Kang Hyung-un, who is sitting right next to me, because the LA riots is a significant event in my life. The Korean image was very unique at the time, and we didn't have much photos, and columnist Kang Hyung-won was able to take so many photos at the time, which helped quite a lot of us. So taking this opportunity, I'd like to express my gratitude to Mr. Kang. Well, I was born in the States, and then I came back to Korea when I was 3 years old, and then spent until 17 years old, and then went back to the States. In the beginning, I had a great concern over my identity. And you know that Korean society is not actually a multi-cultural society, but living in the States, I realized that I belong to the minority, because from 3 years old until 17 years old, I belong to a homogeneous nationality, but living in the States, I began to realize that who am I? What is my identity? What should I do? And I am no longer so-called justifiable Korean. And then at the time, I had to choose my nationality. So I have chosen my nationality as American. And I thought that what kind of Korean American should I be? And if I become American citizen, what does that really mean? Should I become mainstream? Should I become like one of white people? And then I went to university, and then I met Lee Kyung-hoon, who is quite widely known reporter, and the importance of the LA riots were well taught to me, and he taught us how important that incident was. And then there was a Korean American Students Congress held when I was college students. I learned quite a lot. I realized the importance of becoming one of the minority. That's all I can say. Thank you. Frankly speaking, let me confess, I am your fan, Director Chun, and I have seen your work many times, and I took part in your lecture many times. Whenever I go there, there is an image, or there are contents or video that you always use. That's the the video that you have taken during the LA riots, and also the elderly reporter E were actually yelling at Korean immigrants in the States. You have not directly experienced LA riots, but as one of the Korean immigrants living in the US, probably you can tell us the influence or the impact that Korean immigrants felt at the time. Well, columnist Kang, at the end of his presentation, he showed a slide that says LA riots. We are trying to redefine the concept of riots, but in the States, the riots, we don't use that, but we use the word civil uprising. So not riots, but civil uprising. Why do we use that? Because there are people who actually cause riots, and Hispanics or blacks, they attack Korean people, or they cause a lot of social conflict. They are actually offenders, but what we are looking at from the progressive or scholar's perspective, we have to understand what are the main causes. Why did they carry out such a social uprising? Is it because of the racial discriminations or nationality issues? So that is why we are using riot / social uprising, especially Korean immigrants. We use that as a April 29th incident, because there was a time when the riots happened. It's more neutral, and instead of using riots or social uprising, we use April 29th incident. And as you mentioned, LA riots, through that uprising, the Korean identity has been emerged as one of the important issues related to the K-diaspora. And before that, we talk about Korean immigrants. We used to call ourselves as Korean immigrants, but after that, we call ourselves as Korean American. That means Japanese American. Their time spent in their prison camp, it gave a huge influence in their identity. But through LA riots, also Korean immigrants living in the States, we began to reinterpret, re-understand the importance of our own identity. But there aren't many Korean immigrants, especially the younger generation. They don't really understand the significance of that. And even if in my same generation, the significance, the implication of the LA riots are not well understood. So that is why I go here and there talk about that. Well, Director John, you are saying that your own voice is also quite a minor voice, but you also actually showed the photo taken by Director Lee. Let me give you one tip. There is a movie called Choson, and that is about to be released in Korea. And once again, the introduction of his movie is also the quotation from Director Lee. So if you go to the movie theater, you can see this movie. Now, the identity is now being fall deeper into chaos. Not only director, but the second generation, the third generations of the Korean immigrants, they always experience this, right? Living in the state for a long time, is there any changes that took place in your own identity, such as confused about your own identity? The moment I left Korean society, I began to live as a Korean immigrant. But there were many upheavals and also incidents that made me feel like I am Korean American. Each country, each generation have their own April 29th incident moment. Mr. Park, what is April 29th incident for you? Your own personalized April 29th incident. So I guess it was a Chinese Cultural Revolution that started from the 1969 until 79. During the Cultural Revolution era, Chinese, so-called Korean immigrants living in China, they sort of all gave up their own identity because they began to look over their own life. Instead of calling South Korea, they call as Republic of Korea. But the moment they call as Korea, the name itself, they were regarded as espionage. So I guess that was a great event for me. It was like April 29 incident. And I'm sure that the April 29 incidents could be interpreted differently by each generation. Well, if 30 years have gone by, that means one generation is replaced by a new generation. And you know that nowadays there's also a lot of anti-American incident happening in the States. And we need to understand that. We need to pose a question about that. And now is the time that we need to do something about that. It's a critical moment. Thank you.
마지막으로
Last but not least, this is not really a question, but this movie, Chosun, it's about to be released in Korea. So it's about a movie of Korean people living in the United States trying to enter American political circle. So director, would you like to introduce the movie yourself? Because many people are watching us online for this session. So this is a great opportunity for you to actually promote your movie. Can I spend the rest of the time promoting my movie? Probably yes. Chosun starts covering the LA riot, but the ending is about anti-Asian crime taking place in the US. And there were 5 Korean people who tried to become the politicians at the federal House of Representatives. And it is a story about survival, political representation in the United States. On the other hand, it is also about the structure of conflict among Korean people, different between generations, different religious groups. There are certain conflicts among Koreans in the United States. If we cannot move past these conflicts, we'll never be able to have a true representation of Korean people in the US. So in early November, you will be able to watch my movie in Korean. I hope you can all see my movie. Through discussion with the 3 panelists, we have gone through the history and the social circumstances, and we've actually heard from Korean American. And now we would like to hear from somebody who has been on the site, Director Choi Sang-guk of Korea International Network. So Director Choi Sang-guk. So we've talked about Korean community in the United States. 75 million Korean people living in the living overseas, and Korea International Network has done a lot of work for Korean diasporas living abroad. So what are the specific challenges that Korean people face overseas? I think it could be different from country to country. So what are the problems, the major challenges for Korean communities outside Korea? This year is the 30th anniversary of LA riot. And this is actually 120th anniversary of Korea's first immigration to the United States that started from Incheon in 1902, changing ships in Shimonoseki in Japan, and then they landed in Honolulu in 1903. So this is a very important year for Korean American immigration history. And Korean people are living in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and this is 30th anniversary of diplomatic ties with these countries and also with Vietnam. And after we normalized diplomatic ties, we were in the throes of Cold War. So we could not meet many Korean diasporas living abroad, and they were not fully recognized as Korean diasporas by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea. And in China and former Soviet Union, there were about 3 million to 3.5 million Korean diasporas living in those areas. So in early 1990s, we saw a great emergence of a large number of Korean diasporas in China and former Soviet Union, the former communist countries. And diasporas from former communist countries could not benefit as the diasporas of Korea. And once the borders were open, the mother country, Korea, just saw them as a new source of labor force. Not equally accommodating them as a equal member of Korean community. They were reduced to simple labor workers. And in 1997, there has been some laws instituted for fair treatment of Korean immigrants. But the people who left Korea before a certain date, they could not benefit from this law. And they staged some demonstrations. And the Constitutional Court later saw this was in violation of Constitution and ended up in revising the law. But in spite of that, some of the diasporas from Central Asia or former Soviet Union could not get their visas immediately issued by the Korean government because there has been some discrimination against these diasporas, and visa for visitation is still continuing to this day. During that time, Kim Young-sam administration worked very hard under the catchphrase of globalization, but ironically, many Korean diasporas actually felt higher barriers to entry to South Korea. Well, Korean communities are truly diverse in their nature. And let me talk about Chinese diasporas. And once the Chinese Koreans, one of the people who came to Korea early on, they have been living in Korea almost 30 years. So many of them have been assimilated. And Koryo in the diasporas from the former Soviet Union, they began visiting Korea in 2007. The biggest problem for them is the language barrier because many of them speak only Russian. So they have difficulties in getting jobs in Korea. So they are usually working at the lowest level of labor, 3D, the so-called 3D jobs. And Korean Chinese or Koryo-in living in Korea, they all share the difficulties coming from educating their children. And especially during the pandemic, the students had to study online. And it was difficult for Korean-in's children to catch up with online classes because of this language barrier. And the Korean government has encouraged many diasporas from Sakhalin to immigrate back to South Korea. And Sakhalin diasporas benefited from Korean government's efforts to legalize their immigration back to South Korea. But they had a very narrow time window. People who have immigrated after a certain date were allowed to come back to South Korea as legal residents. And, you know, the first generation immigration still had to be alive for their children to legally come back to South Korea. But if the first generation parents have died, the children could not come back to South Korea. You know, it's quite unfair for them. Losing parents early on is bad enough. And because your parents is dead, you cannot come back to your homeland. That is quite unfair. So the entire Korean diasporas in Sakhalin, not all of them benefited from the revision of law in South Korea. So there are so many problems that we have not been able to perceive when it comes to treating our diasporas fairly. It seems like there are so many challenges or tasks that we need to tackle. So I have met Director Che so many times this year, and it was all about establishing the basic law for Korean diasporas. Can you talk about why we need a basic law or the government ministry for diasporas? The basic law for Korean diasporas was first initiated by a former legislator in 1997, and it is still not being legislated to this day. And the biggest challenge is having a basic law that can institutionalize any legislation for diasporas. And I would like to add one more thing to that, and that is helping these diasporas come back to Korea. Some of them are unfairly treated and discriminated against in the current legislation. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs policies for diasporas need to be fundamentally revisited and reviewed and corrected if there is any room for improvement. That should be the starting point. So that kind of understanding needs to be reflected properly in the basic law for diasporas. So 7.5 million diasporas, some of them are still living in foreign countries, and many of them have returned to Korea. But even in Korea, we have a large number of diasporas who are living in Korea. So there are 1 million diasporas living in Korea. And Korean people who used to live in China and former Soviet bloc, and the way they are treated by Korean media and formally being excluded in the policy, public arena, and any discrimination. So Director Che, how do you think the Korean people need to coexist with the diasporas in Korea? Any ideas or proposals? Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the main ministry responsible for dealing with issues related to diasporas, and they're focusing on helping them to settle down in Korea and promoting communication with diasporas. But for diasporas who have already returned to South Korea, there is no main government ministry responsible for helping them. The Ministry of Justice is partially responsible, but it is not fully responsible. So by establishing the basic law for diasporas, we want to create a ministry that specializes in issues related to diasporas. So we need that institutional basis and anti-discrimination law that also needs to be promoted. When it comes to hatred and issues related to coexist, it actually falls upon the majority of the society to be more inclusive and accommodative towards minorities. So the Ministry of Justice is carrying out various social integration programs, but the majority of the society should look for ways to be more inclusive and accommodating to the minority groups. In that regard, I think the history of Korean immigration needs to be educated properly and more accurately. Korean immigrants in foreign countries, they learn foreign history. And those in Korea, we only learn about Korean history. So there is lack of education for the history of Korean immigrations. There should be mutual understanding for us to find ways for coexistence. Thank you very much.
이야기 잘
Thank you so much. Well, we have invited 4 panelists and we're able to hear very constructive remark. Those of you joining us via YouTube or also on site, I'm sure that you might have felt many things. Now, based on what we have been discussed so far, let's open the floor and have a free discussion from now. So, the director has posed a question since the title of our youth session is LA Riots, but still, as the panelists have mentioned, we are looking forward. Instead of just focusing on the past history, we are trying to find the solutions so that we can take more future-oriented perspective. So, also, Professor Yoon talked about mutual recognition. So do you have any sort of solutions that you can give us regarding taking more mutual recognition attitude? Well, if you look at our compatriots or our Korean people living abroad, but they are discriminated and we fully sympathize with them, we understand that. But if you look at our past history, there was a movie called, what was it? Deep Blue Night, where actor An Sung-gi appears. There was a Korean immigrant living in the States illegally, and she got married to get the green card. So constantly, the immigration officer visit her to check whether her green card is legal one or not. So although you are illegal residents, still they are Korean immigrants, and we had those sympathetic feeling. Whenever I look at that, I feel so sorry for her, and you know that we can understand that, especially why are they under such a great pressure, and we are so upset with that. But what about us? What about how are we addressing the immigrants living in Korea? Whatever we do, sometimes we regard our actions as a justifiable one. In case of COVID-19, you know that we didn't have much facial mask. And what did we do? Mask. And what do we do? I mean, we received sort of a ration. And what about the Korean residents living in abroad? There was heated discussions about whether we should give that to them or not. But there were a lot of people raising voices saying that Korean national living in Republic of Korea should be our foremost priority. There's a saying that if we love each other, then we can call it a romance. But if the third party look at that, they might think that this is an affair, just like that. Depending on which perspective you look at it, there could be a totally different translations or interpretations, quite ironically. So we should not have a double standards. That's like a hypocritic attitude. Whatever we have done, because of lack of recognition, sometimes we make misunderstanding. And sometimes when our actions and what we say doesn't coincide, then we feel bad and we feel uncomfortable. In order to resolve such uncomfortness, we do our utmost effort. So sometimes we don't really understand the people living in Korea. And the first way we need to do is, ironically, or sometimes the actions that we take is very hypocritic one. Especially, this is totally antinomy, and we need to get rid of that. For that reason, education is critical. And once again, I have this strong belief that by educating ourselves, we can mutually recognize each other and we can get rid of such perceptions or prejudice and discrimination as well. And instead of looking one group as one individual, we should look at them as the member of our society. You and I, we are different, but we belong to the same group. We are the member of the same society. And that should begin from the law itself. But you know how it starts? We sort of put a boundary between I belong to this category, you belong to that category. So we are different, but we need to get over that. We need to transcend that. So we need to re-categorize ourselves. I belong to A, you belong to B, but instead of that, A and B is falling under a big umbrella, and then we belong to the same group. If we do that, then we become we, or the same group. And as Mr. Chair already mentioned, the minority discrimination must be resolved because it happens by the majority. So the majority needs to change their perception. In light of that, I believe the general public in Korea, I have a favor to ask of them. They need to understand that the category or the classifications of so-called Korean national, we need to widen and include more people. So the boundary of Korea should be expanded in its width and depth. I'm not only talking about the size itself, but our acceptance, our mindset should be widened. We are suffering from the low fertility rate and also low birth rate. If this continue, then the population decrease happens so quickly that we will never be able to overcome the population cliff. And that's the way we shouldn't go. So now's the time that we need to contribute to our society. And one way to do that is we need to welcome the immigrants coming from abroad who can contribute to the social economic development. That's the way we need to understand these minority. If we do that, then we can enjoy a joint growth. So immigrants or also the Korean people living abroad, we can definitely become the member of Korean, the country itself. So when we do that, the hatred, the prejudice, or the discrimination can be totally scrapped. So we can build a totally a grandiose Korea. So foremost, we need to encompass them. That's the way for us. It depends our survival.
기자님도 코멘.
So, columnist Kang Young-won, do you have a comment? Thank you, Professor. As you have rightly pointed out, the identity of Korean nation cannot be monopolized by people living in Korea. You really need to get rid of that kind of belief. And based on my research as a columnist, I think that the identity of Korean people came from the US. In 1913, in the first Korean community in Riverside in the United States, our leader, Dosan An Chang-ho, has gathered the Korean people there and has adopted the Korean constitution based on American values. And that's how the Korean government was first established. We've had 1,000 years of dynasty, but all of a sudden we became a democratic republic. So national identity has inherently the identity of Korean Americans embedded in it. I have worked in the US my whole life. And I have worked with mainstream American media, but Professor Yoon, said that the Korean people are always hampered by the glass ceiling, but I have worked in the US mainstream community all my life, and there is always a way for us to promote ourselves, get past the glass ceiling before we think about whether it's a Korean or non-Korean. Well, if we live in the US throughout our lives, we have pride in our culture, in our history, and proud of the contribution of our homeland to the mankind. And the pride as Korean American. That has been a source of my confidence in the US, and wherever I went to in the United States, I have proudly introduced myself as Korean American. I have always been proud and open about my identity, and we need to train Korean young people about that kind of identity. Chusa was first developed by Chusa Kim Jong-hee, and Kim Jong-hee during Cheong Dynasty has learned the most advanced technology from Cheong Dynasty even when he was in exile. So what does international culture mean? Well, these days, it's the ways of America, the most powerful nation in the world, and the way of America is inherently embedded in our national identity. If we have accurate understanding of our history and the national identity of Korea, it includes all of the above, and we need to realize that in approaching our future. And including North Korean people, well, half of the Korean population lives overseas, and we need to accommodate them and treat them as Korean people. And we have always been a strong cultural power, but our ideas are still stuck in the 20th century. And I think the Korean teachers should do a better job of teaching their students. And Joseph Jun, he is a Korean man born in the United States, and my sons were born in the United States, and I want them to be the part of American mainstream community, but I want them to know their roots and be proud of their roots, and that is why I continue to write historic and cultural columns, and you can buy my books starting today in Kyobo Mungo. They're both available in Korean and English. And now in Korea, I can see many Korean people dyeing their hair, going through plastic surgery to look more like Westerners. But it's okay, but you have to know your roots before you decide to become who you want to be. If you lack in your sense of roots, then we are going to be groundless, identityless people. So as we face rapid changes, we need to always go back to where we all started and be mindful of our national identity. We are part of one of the longest history civilization in the world, and be proud of our ancestors and always feel proud and confident of being Korean wherever you go. So the teachers really need to provide a sense of roots to their students. South Korea is virtually an island. We are trapped in this island. So we have limited horizon or perspective, so we need to widen our horizon and perspective of the world. And when Korean people live abroad, that is an extension of Korean territory wherever they are, in Latin America, North America, or Central Asia. They eat Korean food and they speak Korean language. Korean language has one of the largest number of words and vocabularies in the world. And we need to be proud of our heritage, regardless of where we live. And Korean diasporas, you should not discriminate diasporas depending on where they live now, Korea, China, Japan. That is unimaginable.
Well, I just introduced the Joseon movie, and then once again, columnist Kang is showing his book, and you'll be able to buy from the bookstore. So let me pose a question to Director Chun. We talked about these issues, but ever since there is anti-Asian hatred, we talk about this antinomy, but still, internally, probably, if we reflect that, isn't the antinomy exist in our deep heart? Probably there could be that kind of feeling, especially the immigrants coming from the Asian countries, working in the workplace in Korea. How do we feel about that? You belong to M generation, right? Millennium generation, right? So how do you see that? And the prevalent situation that is happening in Korea, the exclusions or the discrimination that is happening within Korea, do you have any comment for that? That we discriminate the Asian workers? One of the professors that I respect mostly, there's a Professor Kang, and Diasporic Feminist Theology is the title of the book that he has written. And he defines two diaspora. One is a classical diaspora people who live geographically a different place. And second, diaspora is perceptually how they divide themselves from the Korean nationals. Not only geographically, they live away from Korea, but also they have diasporic identity. What do I mean by diasporic identity? That means the complexity or diversity, the minority, all of these complexity exist in a mixture. So the minority, what does it make it possible? They look at other minority with a great compassion, or if there are any discrimination happen or injustice happen to another minority, then they become angry. And as I mentioned before, the only way Korean needs to go is when we encompasses this diasporic word, then we are going to the right directions. Somebody mentioned already about the low fertility and birth rate, but Korea, Republic of Korea joins the border with North Korea, and we need to work hard to realize the coexistence. So it is our destiny. We need to live with them together. And there's 2.5 Korean national living in the States. And also there are many other national coming to Korea to realize Korean dreams. And whether we want it or not, these are our destiny that we need to grapple with and tackle with. Morally, what is our ideology? I don't think we have any idea at all, or we are lacking that idea. And probably our neighborhood, they might have that. And there are some people who have capacity to encompass that. Those people are the Korean immigrants living in other countries. They already been treated as the minority. So unconsciously, they know how to treat the other people. So such diaspora, we need to learn from that. And also, there are a lot of organizations, including the Overseas Korean Movement Organization. And if you look at the Korean textbook for the primary school, he tried to find out whether there's any word mentioning about the K-diaspora, and 150 different kinds of textbook he scanned through, but never once, even though he looked for 150 textbook, never once the concept of the diaspora were mentioned. And for the first time, there was an image introduced when it was tackled during the movie called Other Foreign City or Young Policeman, and that deals with the Korean immigrants living in China who commit crime. That was the first time the concept of diaspora was mentioned. So the educational, social, cultural issues continuously happen because of our attitude, because of our perception. So diasporic society is the only way we can go. Thank you.
저희
So Director Choi Sang-go, well, time is running, I heard that diaspora movement is going through a difficult time. So could you talk about or ask for more support for diasporas, including funding and other types of support? I think diaspora policies need to be given more attention in Korea. And the Korean government really needs to establish more policies and support for Korean diasporas. And definitely there is a very strong need for that. Korea is an OECD member country. And because of that, Korea provides 2 trillion won for ODA, and this official development assistance is increasing every year. But the annual budget for Diaspora Foundation is only 60 billion won. Of course, there are separate budget for Korean language training, but apple to apple, it's 2 trillion against the 60 billion won. So I think, well, when you include the North Korean people, you have to remember that 10% of Korean people reside overseas as diasporas. So diasporas definitely needs more attention and support. So let us wrap up free discussion. We were supposed to have some Q&A, but because of limited time, we won't be able to do a Q&A with the audience. So we have heard from Korean diasporas, leaders, media, professors, directors, and movie directors. Thank you very much for joining us, and please give them a big round of applause. Well, LA riots was just a keyword that we used to talk about the history of diasporas. And we have to think about the immigrants, minorities, minority workers, marriage, immigrants. All these minority groups need to be considered. One more point. There are many intellectuals, elites living in Korea. And they come to the United States to study. And they study very hard. And Korean Americans already know that information. You can bring the Korean Americans to Korea and let them do the work. And if you bring the Korean German who lived in the Germany all his life, they would know much more about Germany rather than sending Korean students to Germany to study in later stage of their life. Thank you very much for that point. And I would like to thank Horizon. And Horizon has prepared a short video. And let us watch the video as a wrap-up to this session. Thank you very much for.
저는 일본에서 온 이유진이라고 합니다.
중국에서 살다 온 23살 박은평입니다.
멕시코에서 살다 온 24살 박주연입니다.
안녕하세요. 미국에서 살다 온 23살 이수진입니다.
브라질에서 살다 온 신영림이라고 합니다.
삼육보건대학교에서 연구교수로 있는 김태진입니다.
저는 홍콩에서 살다 온 23살 홍채연입니다.
과테말라에서 살다 온 이수빈이라고 합니다.
저는 남미 에콰도르에서 살다 온 23살 방조원입니다.
기본적으로는 이제 문화가 다른 것 때문에 굉장히 많이 문화, 컬처 쇼크라 그러죠. 동양적 문화와 서양적 문화가 너무 달라서 문화적으로 적응하는데 좀 많이 힘들었던 것 같아요. 예.
정체성 혼란이 있었던 기억이 있어요.
교육을 받는다는 것은 또 생활 언어랑 많이 다르니까 언어적인 차이가 제일 힘들었던 것 같은데
문화 차이와 그리고 인종차별을 겪었던 적이 너무 많아서
비교적으로 수평적인 문화에서 살아왔는데 한국에 와보니까 여기는 수직적인 그런 위아래 문화가 더
오히려 그런 어려움이 있었지만 더 친구들하고 더 친하게 지내려고 노력을 했었습니다.
당연히 이제 언어 열심히 공부하려고 했고
브라질 문화, 한국 문화에 대해서 더 많이 공부를 했던 것 같아요.
친구들을 도와줄 수 있을 만한 사람이 되기 위해서 공부도 많이 했던 것 같고
로마에 가면 로마법을 따라라 라고 많이들 하시는데 잘 적응하고 살려고 노력하는 게 중요한 것 같습니다.
해외에서 내 뭔가 고향을 떠나 살아가는 게 외롭고 쉽지 않은 일인데 오히려 장점으로 만들 수 있는 기회가 되고
그러는 가운데 무엇보다 나에 대한 자신감, 나를 사랑하는 것이 우선이라는 것을 알게 되었어요.
어느 나라에서 왔든 사실 한 개인으로 서로를 배려해주고
어느 나라 사람을 따지는 게 아니라 그냥 사람 개인을 존중하는 게 좋을 것 같습니다.
그러니까 한국 문화, 한국인, 한국어, 나의 문화적 배경에 대한 자신감이 결국 다수민족 사회에서는 그것이 우선되어서 그 다음에 타문화를 이해하는 데 오히려 더 밑바탕이 되지 않나 그런 생각을 했습니다. 예. 한국의 힘을 넓히는 주역이라고 저는 생각합니다. 그래서 여러분 사시는 곳에서 한국인으로서 자신감을 가지고 더욱더 풍성하고 아름다운 생을 가꾸시길 바랍니다. 여러분 화이팅!